All right, so we're just gonna give it one more minute.
Yeah.
Let folks get into the room. Thanks everyone for showing up tonight. I will say now, and I'll say it again later on, please mute yourselves during the recording towards the end of the event. You can type your questions into the chat or use the raise hand function. And Deb will be happy to call on you towards the end or whenever you guys want to answer questions. But yeah, we'll get started in just a second.
Excellent.
Hey, Tom.
Oh, Tom's here.
Who's that?
And, there he is.
He's a Chicago book-selling fixture.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Hello, hello.
All right, let's get started.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Authors on Tap, Exile in Bookville's long-running reading series, where we host amazing and talented writers who are in conversation with other amazing and talented writers. I am Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, run this beautiful bookshop at 410 South Michigan Avenue, Suite 210. Tonight, we have an amazing show lined up, so let's meet our esteemed guests. Matthew Specktor is the author of the novels American Dream Machine and That Summertime Sound, as well as a book of film criticism, The Sting, and the memoir, The Golden Hour, which is forthcoming from Ecco Press. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, GQ, Harper's, the Paris Review, The Believer, and numerous other periodicals and anthologies. He is a founding editor of the LA Review of Books. If we have time later, I want to ask you about the book you wrote about The Sting, which is one of my favorite films of all time for the Deep Focus book series, which I just discovered because of your book. So I want to talk about that later. That's
Really
cool
I
series.
like that. Yeah.
Deborah Shapiro and her wonderful family live here in Chicago. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, LA Review of Books, Sight Unseen, Literary Hub, and elsewhere. She is the author of the novels The Sun in Your Eyes and The Summer Demands. By the way, I always forget to do this, but here they are. Both favorites of mine. I absolutely love both novels by Deborah. Before we get started, once again, I want to say to those of you who tuned in tonight, you're encouraged to keep your cameras on, but please mute yourselves. If you have a question for either of our guests, please type it into the chat and Deb will be happy to pass it along to Matthew or use the raise hand function near the end of the event. Books by both authors will come with signed book plates or actual signed books when Deb comes to the store and can be purchased through our brand new fancy website, and we will post that in the chat. I'm going to get out of the way now. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Take it away, Deb and Matthew. Have a good show.
All right.
Great.
Thanks, Javier. So I just wanted to say a little bit about this book that I love. I was lucky enough to read an early version and I was just rereading it. And I'm really kind of just amazed by the way that Matthew sort of blends memoir, but also cultural history and these kind of totemic or talismanic figures in his life. And the way it's all interwoven and kind of interconnected. And the way that it kind of maps one person's psychology while at the same time like literally mapping Los Angeles, both kind of as an actual place and also as sort of like a not quite a dreamscape because you actually live there, but just a place.
It can also be a dreamscape.
Yeah, Los Angeles is the imagination, or like Hollywood, I guess.
Yes.
And so I'm really excited to talk to you about sort of how this all came together and just all of the. I think one of the things that I love about this book is that all the echoes and the resonances that just keep recurring throughout this book. The way that all of the figures that you write about, whether it's F. Scott Fitzgerald or like maybe figures who aren't as well known today, like Eleanor Perry, as a writer, and just the way that they're all interconnected, obviously through you, but there's also, it was just really interesting to trace that while I was reading.
Yeah.
So why don't I let you read it?
I'll read it. I'll read a tiny piece, and then we'll get to talking. It's very funny to read from this book because unlike partly because of the pandemic and partly because of the kind of book it is, usually when I'm writing a novel or something, I'm in it for long enough that by the time I'm done with it, I will have read portions of it in public. And with this one, I got to, I suddenly realized when I finished it, I was like, God, I'm going to have to read from it. And I have no idea what I'm going, how I'm going to do that because it's so,
pretty stark.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought, in this particular case, I can start, at a kind of moment in the text of maximum personal objection, which always seems like a good place to start. If you can, kind of humiliate yourself a little bit or delve into your embarrassment, I've always found that to be a good spot. And this is the beginning of a section in the book that is winds up being about Warren Zevon, but this part is fairly memoiristic, the beginning of it. I fell in love with a television writer, crucifying myself one more time, the last time, I hoped, on the altar of the motion picture industry. I performed every romantic gesture, letters, flowers, playlists, a chain of clever text messages that went on sometimes for hours until I barely recognized myself, until I did recognize myself as the scared adolescent I once was decades earlier. Love hurts, the song goes. It hurts more when you decide simply to skin yourself alive. I met Q on a dating site. Everybody in this book gets an initial. This one gets Q, unfortunately for her. My first mistake was to take everything at face value. We went to dinner at a place on Highland Avenue, sat under golden lights that made her look large-eyed, heavy-lidded, with a smile that spread across her cheeks like wine sinking slowly into fabric, like a Jewish Italian goddess. I adored her disproportionately, placed speculative bets on a future even before dessert, which neither of us wanted to eat, arrived. We sat for 3.5 hours, after which I kissed her on the street as she leaned against a street lamp. I'm seeing someone else, she said. The air around us was halogen-rich, glowing. She leaned forward to kiss me again. I don't think I like him very much. She smelled like God's laundry, a pheromonal trap. I drove home 10 minutes later, car stereo blaring. It was as if I had been injected with a slow-acting poison, a paralyzing agent that wouldn't take effect for a few days. I don't think I like him very much. Those words rang in my head the next morning. Then why are you seeing him? I might have asked, if I were not, then, as always, slow to heed an internal warning. She had waited almost 4 hours to tell me that. Oh, well, I texted her anyway. And when we went on another date, and then another after that, the same thing happened. Little remarks like fishhooks, tiny cruelties that slipped beneath my skin without pain until it was too late, until I was bound in place like Gulliver tied to the shore by Lilliputians. I love you, I said. I think I might be falling in love with you too. 6 weeks maybe had elapsed. 6 weeks of flirting and chasing, of lurching pursuit, 6 weeks of kissing, and more recently sex. 6 weeks of waiting, always a little too long, for our text thread to resume, declarations of ardor, mine, and of half ardor, semi-ardor, that were just enough to keep me going. I hope you do, I said, but what I meant was, I'm going to make you. We all know how that turns out. The sex was desperate, a little messy. I felt like I was trying to climb a mountain with webbed hands, unable to gain purchase with someone who, this was the core of it, just didn't like me as much as I needed to be liked. I never asked about the other man again, just assumed in my narcissistic blindness that had come to a full stop. Maybe it had, but after another few weeks of this, of my hard-charging pursuit and her lawyerly caution, she called. I can't see you. No? My voice leaked out of me like helium fleeing a balloon, a tinny infantile squeak. Are you breaking up with me? I don't have the feelings I thought I'd felt. I don't remember what I said next. I was too stunned by what I sounded like. a smurf or a very young child. I was visiting a friend in Topanga Canyon, staring out the window at our daughters on his sun-swept patio with the blue glitter of the Pacific far, far below. In a space a lot like this one, almost 30 years earlier, I had decided to become what I was, a writer. But I had no words for what I was experiencing, a murderous distress that revealed me for the weakling I was too. Life with my mother had been like this when she was at her most wild and abusive, and I was just a helpless teenager. But there, I was living with an addict. Here, I was just chasing another human being who happened to want, no matter how much it pained me, something else.
Okay, so
yeah.
Your moment of objection. We will now dissect.
Yeah, work a day objection. Yeah, totally.
So aside from just, the beautiful prose in this book, what I love about that passage is the way it goes on to kind of talk about how the loss of a fantasy or an ideal in some ways is harder than the loss of something real. You talk about it being in some ways harder on you emotionally than your divorce was.
Yeah.
In some respects. And I guess the loss of a dream, I think, ties into a major theme of the book in terms of a lot of it, and I should have said this, in the intro, a lot of it is about our notions of success and failure and what constitutes success and what constitutes failure. And I think, when you lose something real, it's real and therefore it's flawed and complicated and probably, compromised in some ways. When you lose an ideal, and maybe it's whether it's an ideal a fantasy you've formed about a person, or if it's a fantasy you have about your own ambition or your own success, where you want to see your own work go. I think they're similar. I don't know.
Yeah. I do too. I mean, I think that there are those fantasies of achievement or of completion, right? Whatever it is that you think, oh, if I can just make this relationship, or usually you have those feelings before you're in an actual relationship. If I can just make this hypothetical, kind of promising situation work out, right? Or if I can just publish a novel, if I can just win a prize, if I can just get this movie made, if I can, I think for most artists and for most people, there are moments in your life where you think, oh, if I can just get this thing in place, it will have worked. My life will be what I want it to be. And that is, I mean, I don't know that it's actually harder, right? I mean, I think when you really lose somebody that you're close to, or lose a person that you are, have a kind of deep and actual relationship with, that's a whole other thing. But there is something very sticky and complicated about losing something that looms up in front of you as immensely promising, even when that promise is a product of your own imagination.
Yeah.
And then there it goes. And that does, I think, tie to, that it's a similar kind of dreaming. It's that dream of being fulfilled.
Yeah. When you were writing this passage, this is probably, you sort of interlace very personal passages with these more kind of, cultural histories of these various figures that have resonated in your life, or that have meant something to you. What was it like writing the more kind of personal aspects versus the more kind of
that's a good question, simply because I think that there's something about writing for me that is both kind of needs to be personal in order for me to be interested enough to do it, but it also needs to be elliptical. It needs to be in writing. I don't, even though I think that there are a lot of passages in this book that are quite kind of confessional, I usually don't respond to or don't really pursue writing on my own that's only confessional. It's like I feel like there's always something being revealed, and there's something being concealed or kind of approached at an oblique angle. And I think that's kind of why, like, I would never have wanted to write this book if what I had in mind was just a memoir.
Mm-hmm.
And if what I had in mind was just a kind of collection of meditations on cultural figures, like that would be fine, but I'm not sure that that would have kind of sustained itself either. So there was definitely a sense of sort of, a propulsive, like a quality of tacking back and forth. That's where, that I kind of used to give the book some energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's always a kind of variation or set of variations on that in writing anything for me, like a need to kind of move in, move out. The last novel, American Dream Machine, was all set in Los Angeles, or a very LA book, and so I kept needing to like find excuses to send the story to New York,
Right.
or to London, or like places that weren't LA, because I think otherwise it would have become kind of claustrophobic for me as a writer, and probably claustrophobic for readers too. So, it's like I like that dance, and I felt like it was always a matter of knowing, like, oh, if I stay too long in this one place, it'll break down.
Yeah.
There were places in the drafts of the book where it's like the critical stuff kind of went on, and then I was like, oh yeah, I don't actually like, I'd love to talk about Carol Eastman for 45 pages, but I don't need to.
Right. Good. I'd read it. she's one of the, I think one of the, I mean, they're all fascinating figures, especially in the way that you write about them, but she's in particular is I thought was very, very magnetic.
Yeah, I was very excited. For those who don't know, Carol Eastman is the screenwriter who wrote the movie 5 Easy Pieces. That's what she's best known for. But she has this weird outline. If you kind of read books about 70s Hollywood, there'll be this kind of weird mention of her, like, oh, the screenwriter Carol Eastman, who hated being photographed and was afraid to fly and was agoraphobic and like almost won an Academy Award, and then didn't have another movie made for 17 years, like, and just realizing, like, there was very little information about her. Like, you can find a photo of her on the internet, but really only one. Like there are other photos that claim to be her, but they're not her. That kind of reclusive quality was very, very attractive to me. And then when I went to look at her archive in Texas, to like realize that she was like not just kind of a genius, but like I think a real weirdo, like in the best possible sense. Her writing and her syntax was so peculiar. I was like, holy shit, this is an amazing person.
How did she have an archive? I'm just someone who never sort of achieved a real sort of public recognition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who her executor was, right? I mean, I don't, because she didn't have a family. She wasn't married. I think she has a niece or a couple of nieces, because her brother was this writer, Charles Eastman, who was even more kind of like kind of elliptical and strange. He's famous in Hollywood for having written a script called Honey Bear, I Think I Love You in the 60s that like is this legendary thing where, people like Robert Towne are like, oh, that was the script I read that taught me, how I wanted to become a writer. And but you can't, and apparently even 3 or 4 years ago, it came very close to being made. Scott Rudin told me that Sean Penn like had attached himself to this script and was gonna like really wanted to make it. Which is insane that a script would be like 50 years old and people would still be like I want to make this script. But anyway, I don't know how they ended up at the Ransom Center. I do know that from the looks of it and the feel of it, other than whoever the graduate student was who'd like tagged and cataloged them, I don't think anybody had ever looked at them.
No.
But she's someone who the people who knew her, Jack Nicholson or Michael Silverblatt, who's the host of Bookworm, the KCRW show. He knew her very well, and I think the people who knew her, several of them quite prominent, really understood her to be a huge genius. So that's kind of how she wound up there.
You write about how a number of these figures, or that you tend to admire people whose status has kind of been marginal, despite their work being otherwise.
Yeah, I guess, you know, I mean, I think I do use the word marginal, and that's a very loaded word,
that's a loaded word,
right? Which I know, but I think, you know, certainly I tend to, you know, a lot of the artists that I like are kind of on the, you know, around the periphery of the canon a little bit, right? You know, and I think that mirrors a lot of just my reading and viewing habits. I do have a kind of reflexive interest in kind of like just moving away from the discourse when I can. Not for like snobbish reasons or something. I think it just has to do with really with like a certain kind of like I like there to be a certain quiet around a thing that I'm reading, or, you know, where you just where I don't sort of feel like I'm being called upon to like formulate an opinion, right? You know, and or you know, because I think I like not having one. You know, or I like the feeling of you know, kind of being able to kind of hash out my response to a book or to a movie or whatever, you know, without the sort of pressure of hearing other people talk about it around me. And there's always something great about, you know, even someone like, you know, I mean, some of the people in this book, like Tom McGuane, you know, Tom McGuane was you know, is legendary, and he was a huge deal in the you know, early 70s especially. And but, you know, I don't think people certainly don't read him quite as much as they used to, or they don't talk about it, even though, you know, they should. But there's something nice about you know, turning to those artists. It's like, you know, it's the NYRB classics thing, where it's like, you know, I'm always, you know, I think I said that to you, and Marie said that to you. You know, the Summer Demands is an NYRB classic. You know, that's why it's waiting to happen. You know, and that's it's a, you know, it's a quality, I think, that appeals to me.
Yeah. Do you feel like in some way was part of the work of this book to not so much resurrect these figures, but to sort of shine a light on them? Or was it mostly you just felt that they had some connection to your story?
I wanted to shine a light on them for myself. I mean, I think, you know, one of the other thing is that I think a lot of them, I mean, some of them are people that I just had like a you know, kind of abiding, like massive love for. Some of them, like McGuane is a good example, someone that like I had a huge love for when I was younger and hadn't revisited in a long time. So I was like, I want to go back and see, like, what do I think of that now? Or, you know, it varied. You know, obviously there were some people, and I would say Eleanor Perry and especially Eastman are two people where I thought, you know, more people should know who these people are. There was you know, when I first started thinking, like, who was I going to write about in this book, I made very, you know, just copious lists. It would have been easy, like, to have, you know, 5 or 6 different iterations of this book that didn't have any people in common at all.
Who you left out.
Oh, yeah. so many. And I think, and for very, you know, not because I wasn't interested, or not because, you know, there are millions of, you know, one can never get to the bottom of like all the art from the past that's worth paying attention to. And I think, you know, some of them I left out for, you know, like there was a later section. The section that's about Tuesday Weld was originally going to be about a screenwriter named Claire Noto, who wrote this one kind of like legendary script called The Tourist, which is really, really wild. It's like almost like Blade Runner, but also like kind of hyper sexualized and kind of gory and graphic, like Alien. Like, it's a really amazing thing. But I sort of thought, you know, I've already written about a couple screenwriters. Like, it would be very frustrating to like hinge this book too much on people whose work isn't like available or accessible. Like, you know, you want people to read the book and be like, I want to look at that. I want to see that. I want to read that person. So some people got left out for that reason. You know, there was a novelist and filmmaker named Bill Gunn, who I really wanted to write about, but who I also think is like, his stuff is hard to access. I mean, his 2 novels are out of print, and, you know, last I checked, like, you know, going for like $800 or $900 on Amazon or something. Like, I just thought, like, what's the point of writing about people that other people can't
right, yeah,
find? So, that there were just, some of it was that, some of it was, structural, having to do with like, oh, I've already written about, like, a couple of novelists, like, but I haven't written about an actor or an actress. So, or a musician. Like I wanted to vary the media. There were those sorts of things that went into it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that I really wanted to talk to you about, I feel like this book raised the issue for me, is the difference between success and legitimacy, or feeling legitimized. And I think for anyone who's trying to put some kind of work out in the world, whether it's a book, whether it's a piece of art, music, I think there's this whole, machinery of success that you can either, buy into it wholesale, or you can reject it, but you kind of can't completely, ignore it. But I feel like that's very different than just feeling legitimized in your work, and like you are a quote unquote real writer, or a real artist. And a lot of the people that you write about, is including yourself, I think there is that struggle, and they don't always, a lot of them don't, success isn't all it's cracked up to be. So.
Yeah, well, I think that question of like feeling legitimate is really, that's a really big one. I mean, I think it's not, it's a big one for all artists as they're getting started, and it's something that, I started writing regularly, every day when I was probably 20. I mean, I was writing in high school and college, but like by the time I was like 25, like I had a real practice, and I didn't publish anything until I was 40. So, there were just, kind of novels that agents couldn't sell. There was, the whole story. And so there definitely was a period. And I think where this book opens, I was still kind of in that part of my, at least that temporally in that part of my career. And it's something that, I have a lot of empathy for writers who are struggling with that question, just because I feel like I struggled with it for a long time myself. And the irony is that what confers that legitimacy, I mean, it's like what makes an artist is the practice, right? It's not the publishing, it's not the accolades, and even though I think that's easy to say once one is published and a few books into it, it's like, that's easy for you to say, right? Yes. And I think that's every artist's fight, but but I think it's also true that like when you do start to get that kind of recognition that you think when you're younger, like, oh, that's the thing that's going to validate me, that's the thing that's going to make me like I'm for real, and it turns out really not to.
Right.
I mean, not to of itself anyway. And you still have to, every time you do it or every time you struggle with it again, you're just like, oh God, I'm terrible. Like maybe,
right. Right? Well, it's like a continual restarting. I mean, it's like, like you were saying before, it's like, if I can just publish this one book, that'll do it. That'll be, I'll be set.
Right. And I really did believe that once upon a time.
Yeah. And then it's not, it doesn't really work that way. But Bill Gunn is in the round, right? The Kathleen Collins.
What's that?
The Kathleen Collins movie?
Yes, he is. He appears in the Kathleen Collins movie as an actor. I mean, the thing that's amazing about him is he's kind of everywhere, and the people that show up on the margins of my favorite piece of literary Bill Gunn trivia is that he made this kind of, the one movie of his the one movie that he wrote and directed that's fairly easy to see is called Ganja and Hess. And it's like this kind of psychedelic vampire movie it was on Criterion for a while. Okay. And it's really, really, really wild. But William Gaddis appears in that movie as an extra. He's like a wedding. It's like not a speaking part, but he and his wife like show up as like attendees of this garden party, and you're like, how did that happen?
Well, one of the things that I love about this book is how intertwined it all is, and you write about sort of the sort of geographically, the part of LA that you're writing about is a small area, but it's also just a small world. And you see these sort of figures that you wouldn't think were necessarily connected to each other and sort of crop up. And is it just coincidence? Are these recurrences? I feel like part of the book is making meaning out of these recurrences and these patterns that you notice.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's one aspect of it that's like, well, it's partly because the industry or the kind of the world of the arts is always a little smaller than you think it is, right?
Yeah.
As just described, like how on earth does William Gaddis show up in
right.
Run's movie? But I think some of that too is the sort of pattern recognition and pattern definition that you get from writing anything long form, right? I mean, writing a novel is sort of teasing patterns out of, or discovering and defining patterns that you didn't know were there. And I think there was an aspect of that in this too. I mean, you know, obviously I'm dealing with material that's less elastic in terms of its kind of factual content than I would with a novel. But in many respects, this felt like writing a novel to me. And I sometimes like tell myself or tell people that it is a kind of novel. You know, it's a novel that's full of fact, but it's still also kind of a novel.
Well, and I was just going to ask you about that because I've heard you say that before. Maybe I read an interview where you had mentioned that it's like a novel, and I just wanted to know more about that, especially because I feel like as someone who writes novels, there is this like veil, right, of fictionality. Like it's, you know, these things didn't really happen, even if they're like emotionally true. But at the same time, people, you know, read your books and they're like, oh, well, that must be you, like that, you know,
right.
like that.
Right. Obviously, that's you.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you're writing, you know, something that's a memoir, like it did happen. And how did that feel like to kind of take off the fiction hat and put on the memoirist?
More comfortable than you would think. I think in many ways, I mean, first of all, there was, you know, and I think I said this when I was talking to Lily Enelich the other night too, which is that, you know, to write any narrative, even to write something as simple as like a book review or an essay or, you know, something like that, there's always a sort of the creation of a persona, right? And you know, the self that's speaking is not the self that's sitting in the chair. The self is a kind of personality, even if that personality, you know, pretty much follows the contours of your own personality. And I think that's very true here. I mean, it's like, you know, the things described in the book, you know, that, you know, when I describe things that happened to me, they happened to me, but the person doing the telling feels a little different than me. You know, I think there's a kind of, and that automatically kind of lifts it into, you know, the realm of kind of imaginative writing or, you know, narrative, you know, prose writing. And I think, you know, I've always liked novels that had, you know, that kind of interpolated material, you know, other kinds of content. You know, I think I said to you when we were emailing that I wanted to read this passage because I had gotten some nice words about it from Michael Ondaatje, who's a writer that I just revere and revered when I was much younger. And his early books, the ones that he wrote before The English Patient, like the collected works of Billy the Kid or Coming Through Slaughter, like had this kind of crazy, like there are poems in them, there are photographs, there are swatches of letters, like there are moments where, you know, like they're novels, they're full of, you know, fictitious characters, but then there are moments where the narrator will kind of interrupt and you'll realize that like, oh, that's Ondaatje talking himself, like in a kind of documentary way.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and I remember being very, you know, just kind of flabbergasted by that when I was, you know, 20, 21, like reading these books and just thinking like, wow, like a novel can do that.
Right.
And it's nice to remember that. And it's nice also to think, you know, at a time when, you know, the I don't know, it's like the currency of the novel or the conversation about the novel like feels, you know, like it can feel almost like specialized discourse. You know, it's like I have had people say to me in the, you know, past couple of years in all seriousness, like, oh, you know, I don't read much fiction or something. And I just think like, what is wrong with you? You know, like, like and it's, you know, I kind of like the idea of remembering that like you can do a lot with you know, I mean, and I'm not like, I know this book isn't exactly a novel, but you can do a lot within the space of what we would consider, you know, a novel or a long form narrative book, and it's fun to kind of mix media, so to speak.
Do you feel like, having written a novel just prior to this book,
yeah,
were you reacting in any way against that? Did you feel sort of more freedom in any way, or just different parameters that kind of allowed you to do different things?
Yeah, or maybe just a different set of constrictions. You know, yeah. I think you're always, you know, I'm always looking for the right set of limitations, right? Without that, the work just tends to get kind of plobby. Right. And I had, in the last couple of years, written after American Dream Machine, I wrote a novel and I finished it right before the 2016 election, and I just couldn't. I was like, gosh, there was something about it. You know, my agent was into it, and you know, my readers, my friends close to me were like, yeah, this is good. And I just kept thinking like, I don't know, like, and I realized that I kept responding to books that were very hybrid. You know, I like reading Hilton Al's The Women, right, which is this kind of like 3-part, like, you know, narrative portrait of 3 different women that were part of his life and part of you know, queer life in the village, and at the same time there was this kind of submerged memoir aspect to it, and I thought that's really cool. You know, reading, you know, I don't know, Olivia Lang's book, you know, The Lonely City, or, you know, just seeing these books and being like, I like these, you know, that's the kind of thing I want to do. So that's what I decided to do instead.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like for a certain kind of mind, these figures, whether it's the figures that like Olivia Lang writes about, or that Hilton Als writes about, or that you write about in this book, I mean, they take up so much space in one's imagination. Even if you're not, you know, even if you've never met them, you don't know them.
Yeah.
But they still, and so I don't know, I think it makes sense to write about them, especially if you think of yourself as a writer or an artist, like, who kind of, how else do you learn how to be that, right?
Right.
From these people who you surround yourself with.
Yeah. And I think the same is, you know, I mean, it's like, I always feel like any book that I read, any book that I really tend to connect to as a reader, it's like, I'm always looking for, where does that book lead me? You know, who are the writers behind or adjacent to the writer that I'm reading now? It's like, there's that, you know, I like books that have a feeling of connectedness, you know, to other art and other artists. And so, you know, that too was like enormously satisfying. Somebody emailed me last night, this list. It was just a sort of some reader that was just saying thank you. And he said, look what I did. And he had handwritten this kind of complicated list of people that I'd mentioned in the books, and then other things that he wanted to check out because of it. And I thought, man, that is fantastic. Like, you know, if I gave them not just something that they responded to, you know, as a piece of art in itself, but, you know, but that it then gives them like a syllabus or a, you know, and like, that was the ultimate satisfaction for me.
It's a well, I feel like it's written for, I mean, it's written for anyone, but it's written, I think, especially for people who have that kind of mindset, who are just kind of, you know, kind of like hunger for that kind of information and that kind of input. Just, you know, who find themselves in, you know, rabbit holes on the internet all the time.
Yes. Right. For those who are insatiable in that way. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. No, I'm wondering if there's something that you wanted to talk about that that I haven't brought up.
But we could talk about how Eleanor Perry would be the ideal person to have adapted the Summer Demands. That
Me.
I was really thinking about that. I just, even as we geared up for this conversation, I was like, that's who should have done it. There should be a 1969 Frank Perry, Eleanor Perry version of the Summer Demands.
That would have been amazing. One of the things that amazes me is that there were like, you write about, an interview with her in People magazine, or I think it was in People. I'm like, wow, like People magazine used to cover someone like Eleanor Perry, or it's just, I don't know, the change in the media landscape since the 70s when you're.
That was obviously, I mean, there was something very, I mean, a lot of these figures anchor themselves in the 70s and 80s, right? On some level. And obviously that's a cultural landscape, the landscape of my childhood, in which books, movies, art had a very different position in the culture. And I think this, the book also touches on, that position was, had all kinds of problems just by virtue of being awfully centered on men, awfully centered on white men. I mean, it's horrendous to realize how much great art, speaking of, I mean, Kathleen Collins being a perfect case in point, where you're like, why wasn't that person given the resources that we gave to Hal Ashby? But it's also true, it's like, I don't, there's nothing about the book I hope is nostalgic in that way, right? It's like, it's not pining for a culture that used to be in any way.
It doesn't feel that way at all. It's just kind of been reading it. I was like, oh, right. Like that used to happen.
Yeah. But I think, that's the interesting thing, and this is, I've actually been thinking about this a lot, because I just think that any number of things, I mean, on the one hand, the culture has kind of reduced books. Everything is sort of, IP or, its value tends to be reduced to like, how does it fit into a listicle? How does it, right? How does it fit into the Twitter discourse? I think, the flip side of that is feeling like, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I hear from, I like the fact that I feel like I hear from a lot of readers, and I find myself thinking, the internet maybe has enabled that, right? Has made writers and artists like more accessible, more approachable, and like I think that's like wonderful. Like that's something that I'm in favor of. Like I think it's democratizing in like the best possible way. And I think especially given when there are developing artists or younger artists who are sort of looking for examples or or just even the recognition of like, hey, I'm trying to do this, and it's like the ability to connect with some of those people and encourage that is amazing.
Yeah And I don't think it's nostalgic at all, the book, and the way you write about these people, because it's ongoing. I mean, there's some things that don't change, that sort of struggle between success and failure and legitimacy. I mean, I think the culture changes, but I'm not sure that struggle as an artist necessarily changes all that much.
Or just as a person, I do think this is something that non-artists grapple with too, which is just that feeling of like, how do you know when you've arrived? How do you know when you've done something? I mean, I think there are fields of endeavor where the culture might make it a little easier, where just by showering you with money or whatever it is, right? But I think everybody wants to feel like their endeavors have meaning and have value and like they're achieving something. So hopefully the book is not just talking to artists.
No, I feel like it's just like how to be a person,
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question.
I see that.
Yeah. While reading the first chapter, Introduction of Always Crashing, I was struck with immediate focus and awe. I was wondering, was that the first thing you started writing? What was the beginning of the idea for this book?
Yeah, that's a good. The beginnings of the idea. I mean, I think I mentioned that Hilton Owl's book, The Women, because I think it was right around the time that I read that, where I sort of thought, yeah, I want to do something like this. And I mean, I think Hilton Owl's is pretty brilliant. So trying to kind of hold him up as a model was something I wasn't quite sure how. I wasn't sure what that meant. But I told my agent Allison that I did. I said, I wanted, and she just she started sending me books to read. She sent me Olivia Lang's book, and we kind of immediately. It's always hard, that question of where did it come from? Because I think it was sort of a combination, or what came first. It's always kind of a chicken and egg question. I knew that there were certain people. Eastman was one, Tuesday Weld was one. There were certain people where I thought, I definitely want to write about that person. And then but I didn't quite know what was going to be the unifying. And I knew that I wanted to write about. I knew I wanted to write about my mother, was what it really was. Because as sort of a thwarted female artist and female screenwriter, I wanted that to be kind of an emotional engine for the story. But I think eventually I just had a bunch of names, and then I started to think what did they have in common? And I thought, these are all people that kind of had periods of kind of artistic crisis or artistic shutdown or silence or some kind of obstacle, people whose careers had a kind of measurable or just definable hiccup in them somewhere. And then as soon as I had done that, and as soon as I had kind of decided who the people I was going to write about were, then I wrote that chapter. And as soon as I had the first paragraph and a half, I felt like, I'm located. I think that for any thing that I've ever written, any book that I've ever written, it's always about, it can take me forever to kind of find the right place to start. But once I do find the kind of on-ramp to the book, I tend to just go kind of straight ahead from there.
So was it the writing of it was pretty linear?
Yeah, it was actually. I mean, I'm almost neurotically linear about it. I find I can't do that thing that a lot of writers talk about where they're like, I'm having trouble with this scene, so I'll just go ahead and write another scene. I kind of have to write, it has to be an unbroken line. And if I get to a place where I kind of hit a wall, it usually means I need to back up. I've made a mistake somewhere earlier and I need to, it's it has to be continuous in that way.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear, because there are so many, I like I said before, recurrences in this book. And I don't know if you sort of discovered them as you were kind of writing,
I absolutely discovered them. Yeah, none of those were planned. So there was that kind of weird, I had even if on some level I must have known, I think I did know that I must have known that Frank Perry directed Play It As It Lays, and Tuesday Weld was in Play It As It Lays, or that directed one of Tom McGuane's movies. But there's all that other weird stuff. I didn't know that McGuane and Zevon had written songs together. That was news to me.
Right.
And that was satisfying. But I somehow, because of course the question in beginning this book was sort of okay, these are the people I want to write about. Can I really make them hang together? Can I really make them in the end feel like they really constellate? But I somehow think, even if my intuition had landed on for the same figures and for other people, I still somehow believe that those patterns are a product of the writing itself, and not just kind of not just coincidence.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions?
Anyone else? I always feel like this is
I guess we covered everything.
the shy part of the program. I know. It's I guess we did. Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning
Yeah.
in.
Thank you. And I see Javier up there in the corner.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. We have a crazy storm going on. I don't know if you can see behind me.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Like in Chicago, this line of black, I don't know if you just saw that, but this line of black behind me. I just wanted to ask you, Matthew, if you don't mind talking about
of course
that book series, the Deep Focus.
Yeah.
And that you wrote about The Sting, which I mentioned is one of my favorite movies of all time.
That was a very short-lived. That was a cool series, and it kind of didn't get off the ground. It was a writer named Sean Howe, who's a friend of mine, had brought the idea to Counterpoint Press to Soft Skull, but before Soft Skull was part of Counterpoint, and he wanted to do like basically a 33 1/3 series, but for movies, but I think the idea was initially we were sort of surprised that series didn't exist, I think there's maybe a BFI, like a British Film Institute one or something where the titles are more kind of academic, or it's a little bit more like he didn't want an academic approach. He wanted a kind of extremely idiosyncratic, and the idea was sort of you can write about any movie you want. And what's weird is that when I first signed on to do that, I had signed on to write about Fight Club, which is a movie that I worked on a little bit. That it was, and I had kind of a weird. I mean, I worked on it. I was also the first person to see that book in manuscript, and when I was working at a production company called Jersey Film, someone sent it to me, and I called them up and I said, "You're crazy! Like, this isn't a movie. Like, no one's ever going to make this movie." But I realized that I didn't love the movie enough to want to write about it. And while I was sort of procrastinating that, I looked up at the TV and I was like, oh, The Sting, like there's a movie that I would want to write about. But I think that series, which is only 5 or 6 books, and I think all of them probably sold about 300 copies or something like that. But they're really strange because they're not really about films that are canon. Jonathan Lethem wrote one about They Live, about John Carpenter's They Live, and that is an amazing. His book about They Live is amazing. So they're all kind of peculiarly targeted, and I wish that series had kind of gone on to be like 33 1/3. There should be more of them, but I think Soft Skull was acquired like right around the time that those books came out, and the series kind of died on the vine.
Yeah, and it's funny because Jonathan Lethem did a 33 1/3 for
Fear of Music.
Fear of Music.
He did those, I think, more or less contemporaneously, and they were I kind of read them both in manuscript, and they were the Fear of Music one is great too.
Yeah.
Why is 33 1/3 about movies, about films? Like there should be, right?
There should be. Yeah, there should. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Golden opportunity.
Yeah, right. I mean, and there's 150 of those in the 33 1/3 series so far.
Yeah. There
should be more on movies for sure. And I love the design of the covers for the Deep Focus are really cool.
Yeah.
And because of you, I just discovered them. We're gonna bring them in.
Yeah.
Because, they're still available. So
they're great. Yeah.
How many were there? How many got published before it?
There were 5, I believe.
Yeah, I think there were 5.
Lethem, me, John Ross Bowie about Heathers, this writer Josh Wilker writing about the Bad News Bears in Breaking Training. That one's really great. Josh is such a great writer. And Christopher Sorrentino on Death Wish.
Oh, that's great.
But it would have. I mean, I think it just would have been amazing if that series could have really, spread its wings and there were I think a lot of people that were kind of that were interested in doing them, but then it went away. So
And we didn't plan this conversation to revolve around 33 and a third, but our next event is actually on the 24th. Annie Zaleski, who wrote a 33 and a third based on Duran Duran's Rio.
Amazing.
We will have her in conversation with Gia DeSantis on August 24th at 7 p.m. Central. So those of you tune in, it's going to be a lot of fun. Our name is obviously tied in with music with Exile and Guyville, this fair's seminal 1993 album. So this is our third or fourth music event, and we're trying to do more of these, and we're super excited about this one. And I know that Amanda is out there right now. She loves the small books, and I know she's probably going to start ordering this deep focused series. But thank you guys, the both of you. That was a great conversation.
Yeah, that was great. Deb, thank you so much. And I'm just looking at the chat function. I wanted to say thank you, Elizabeth Rothwell, and thank you, Annie Moore, my kind of reader. Awesome.
And there's Craig. Hey, Craig.
Hi. Oh, there he is.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Is he doing that on purpose?
I don't know.
He's always
I'm sorry. I was chatting. I thought I was chatting everyone to say what a wonderful conversation that was, but I realized I was direct messaging Javier the whole time. So, but thank you. That was really wonderful.
Thank you. It was great.
Tin House is working on a series where writers are going to discuss their favorite after-school special. Anything with Lance Kerwin, Christy McNichols, or Chris Makepeace.
Amazing.
So just very special episodes of sitcoms,
like the Pinball Kids or whatever. Yes.
Just like Tin House, cutting edge.
Thank you. That was wonderful, guys.
That was
really
fantastic.
Great.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thank you.
You can purchase copies of all their books on our website. Go to exileandbookville.com, and we'll be happy to include either signed book plates, or Deb will come into the store and sign them personally. Thanks everyone for showing up. It was a great event.
Yeah, amazing.
Ask for a better one. Yeah. If you guys don't mind sticking around till after the event, everyone signs out. And Craig, if you want us to stick around as well.
Yeah.
And Amanda, if you're there. So.
Are we still here? Are we alone?
Close. Have we stopped recording?